Hi everyone, it's Rabbi Dr. Jack Cohen with the Torah Anytime Dating and Shalom Bias series. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you tonight. Again, anyone out there who needs my help in dating or shidduchim or matchmaking or help you put a top 10 list together, or you have a situation with a relationship that you'd like to have a consultation with, I'd be glad to help you. Just reach out to me from anywhere in the world by calling or texting me to 305-206-1916. That's 305-206-1916, or email me at drjackcohen18@gmail.com. And last but not least, as we say in Hebrew, Acharon Chaviv, the last is the most beloved. I'd like to put a shout out there for Partners in Shidduchim, an incredible organization which is doing so much work to help facilitate people get married. It's free. You can go on there and register for yourself, a friend, a relative, a nephew, a niece. Put them up on there, create a profile for them, and as a result, they'll be there, they'll be seen. You might sometimes go to a social event and see someone and you don't know their name. You could spot them on Partners in Shidduchim. I use that platform all the time to help individuals locate potential partners and set up people. So I think it's an incredible organization that deserves our support, and you should go on there and put up a profile for yourself or help or advise others who could use that as well. In terms of the background checks, it's all taken care of so that we know that the people that are on there are pre-screened, and it's an incredible tool to help facilitate the building of new Jewish homes. I'd like to start tonight's presentation by the following. First of all, I'll talk about the age-old question now that we're in the corona epidemic era. Should I be dating or not be dating? How should I do it? So I'm going to present a question that's been asked to a leading authority, and we're going to digest the response. We'll also then go into the issues of personality differences between a husband and a wife and give case studies. We'll talk about an incredible story of an individual, a married woman who was married 60 years to what she calls a stranger that she never knew. And we'll close with an incredible story about a Gentile girl who consistently kept being told, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? And then eventually decided there's got to be something to this. Maybe God's talking to me and I should consider joining the tribe. And she eventually does and becomes an Orthodox Jew. So let's start with tonight's first presentation. Someone writes, I need some help figuring out this shidduchim during lockdown thing. My daughter was suggested to someone a few weeks before Pesach, and both sides mutually agreed to adopt a wait-and-see approach. Well, we've waited and we've seen that there aren't any drastic changes on the horizon, as we see that authorities are opening up states little by little, but still there's been a bit of apprehension in terms of how far we can go in terms of socializing. The boys' side said they'd like a decision. They have no problem with us saying no to him at this time, and also okay with the couple starting to date on Zoom. They would just like to be able to move on. Is it a yes or is it a no? I get it. I'm just not sure what to do. My daughter has a hard time opening up to new people. She's fine with chit-chat, but when she gets stuck, when she's involved in major discussion, I'm afraid Zoom won't give my daughter a chance to show her true self. And even if they start dating on Zoom, how long do we continue that if things go well? Which has been a question that I've been fielding time and time again in my work as a dating coach. Do we wait until this whole epidemic, COVID-19 pandemic is over to give my daughter the optimal circumstances and say if it's her soulmate, he'll still be around? Or do we go with the second best and say that what's meant to be will be, and Zoom can't change that? Listen to the answer. It's very interesting, and it aligns very, very clearly with my beliefs and my strategies. We don't know enough to even make educated guesses about what's going to happen in our lives. This is all too new, and we don't have enough data. And things are changing on a daily basis as authorities are constantly changing requirements. From the time this question was asked until we answer it, there already will be significant restrictions lifted. So we need to proceed with the assumption that Zoom dates are still a significant consideration and work with the limited knowledge we have. Indeed, that's what's going on today. People are starting their relationships on Zoom in some places and some locations like New York, many even starting to date right away physically, but they just can't go to restaurants sometimes, or they have to eat outside the restaurant, or they're meeting at public locations like parks, etc. Yes, we know people can date on Zoom and even get engaged on Zoom, but we don't yet know what the repercussions will be in those relationships. But if you're looking for an opinion, well, like a nose, everyone has a nose, everyone has an opinion. I think we need to move forward in these unusual times, but we need to do so with our eyes wide open. I don't know if you were struck by how your question highlighted that even coronavirus cannot hold back that which is, bashert, which is determined or predestined for you. Once you use the word bashert, and once you use the phrase what's meant to be to describe two opposite scenarios, but both are basically saying that you recognize that no matter what course you choose, Hashem wants it to happen, and whatever Hashem wants it to happen will happen. Hashem wants it to happen, it's going to happen. If coronavirus taught us anything, it's that Hashem runs the world. So then we're left with the age-old truth. Hashem is in charge of outcomes, and we're in charge of effort. Effort comes to us. And which Ishtadlu seems to be most reasonable now? What should we be doing? That's a great question. What are the risks in waiting, and what are the risks in starting in Zoom dating? And of course, we have to personalize the answers to our friends and to our children. The risk in waiting is that you may lose the shidduch now. Will it come back later? Does that mean it wasn't meant to be? We don't know any of these questions, the answers to these questions. You also face the risk of your daughter losing her drive and motivation, because the longer an individual remains stagnant, they become apathetic and they lose their ambition to do. So we're seeing that staying stagnant in whatever arena is exacting a huge toll on people through this corona epidemic era. We don't want your daughter to fizzle out from hanging around for so long. The risk in using Zoom is that it's a medium that mimics connection but really falls short of creating a connection. As anyone who has experienced Zoom will tell you, that there's something called Zoom fatigue, and that is that you just get tired and becomes very belabored. Being with someone is not the same as seeing someone. Eventually you can start on Zoom 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 dates max, but you've got to then transition into regular physical dating. We've learned from social media that people can have entire personas that are exclusive to social media, which means they can have a completely different personality. There are people who are charming and funny behind the screen in a way that's quite different from their real life personage. There's a real danger of falling for the person without knowing the persona, without knowing the person, because they're faking you out. It's also really hard to get him or get her when you have limited access to their body language, because body language is critical to determining if the person that you're going out with is for you. And you can only assess that when you're with the person physically. It's imperative that before the couple develop a pseudo connection, they need to meet in person to see how the actual person clicks with them. And of course, the issue of attraction can only be fairly measured. Forgive me. In real life. There's a reason a man must see a woman before he agrees to marry her. As the halacha goes, Jewish law mandates that a man must see the woman that he's about to get married to at least once. This becomes very complicated in a socially distant world that we're living in right now. And at what point do we justify the extreme measures needed to meet? Is it 3 Zoom calls? Is it 5 Zoom calls or more? What's the cutoff between I think there's something there we should meet and oops, I think we're very invested? What if none of this is real? And of course, in your daughter's situation, there's the added factor that she has difficulty opening up in conversation. What's becoming clear in this discussion is that nothing is clear. None of the risks in either scenario is insurmountable. While you may lose the shidduch now, it may return. While Zoom is far from perfect as a medium for connection, it's workable as a starting point. So the conclusion would be you need to start with Zoom. You should not wait on the sidelines because you may lose a good thing. It's workable as a starting point. While your daughter may have difficulty being open, it's unclear whether Zoom will help or hinder her ability to engage. As unsatisfying as it is, we have to embrace a certain level of uncertainty, which is where our lives are right now. And then we have to make the decision that on the surface offers the least damage. That seems like reasonable ishtadlus. So what the takeaway from that is that you should not wait on the sidelines. You've got to get started. You should start it with Zoom and then take it from there. If you have any questions on that, reach out to me and I'll be happy to let you know if it's time to transition. Now, let's talk about different personalities between a husband and a wife or between you and your dating partner. And that's very important. When you listen to your dating partner or spouse to gain a greater understanding of who or she is, asking the right questions will increase your understanding. One of the things that I do with all of my clients is train them how to ask the right questions. Hi.
Hi, Dr. Cohen. This is Fardahan. My mother just told me that you were trying to reach me because you have...
Yeah, can I call you back tonight because I'm in the middle of a shi'ur? I'll speak to you.
Yes.
Hi everyone. This is what happens when you're a shadchan. They call you all the time. So that was someone who I reached out to because I made a presentation for a suggestion for a shidduch to her mother. So I'll call her back. Now, the wrong questions will be looked upon as challenges, debates, and attacks. The right questions are clarification questions. You ask them in a gentle tone of voice. One of the things that we have to be careful for is how we ask and how we speak in the tone of voice. Is it musical or is it like scratching on a chalkboard? You are asking to understand why exactly something bothers that person. You're asking why they are interested in something. If you find that your questions are becoming distressful to your dating partner or spouse, Don't ask them right now. You've got to learn tact. Questions can be asked in a way that makes them seem like prying, and people don't like to feel as if they're being invaded or their privacy. Even if that person is someone you know quite long, for a quite period of time, or it's your spouse. Your questions should serve a dual purpose. They should further your understanding of the person, and they should indicate sensitivity to the issue on your part. For this reason, a long list of questions that you can ask might be misleading. If you find that your dating partner or spouse becomes annoyed at the questioning, wait for an opportunity to listen to how someone else asks questions your spouse appreciates and try to mimic that style. If your spouse is cooperative some of the time and not at other times, ask yourself, what is different about this request that's causing her to be irritated or him to be irritated? If you can ask your spouse, terrific, you might get a clear picture. You might hear that certain ways of making a request create cooperation and other ways prevent it. So it's all how you ask the question. It could be the words you said and expressions that you used. It could be the facial language. It could be your tone of voice. When you know what does work well and what doesn't, you can speak in the future in ways that will bring out the best in your spouse or dating partner. If the person replies, I don't know, perhaps you can work it out together. It might be that the way you make your requests makes a difference, or it might be a difference in your spouse's emotional state. In a rested, calm state, your spouse or dating partner will be more open to meeting your requests, your needs, and wishes. Part of understanding your dating partner or spouse is to know what questions not to ask that person, him or her. By observing their facial expressions and body language, you'll pick up the knowledge of what not to ask in the future and avoid areas which are very, conflict-causing and irritating. Even if the person is often open to answering your questions, there are times when your spouse or dating partner would prefer privacy, and you should respect that. And don't keep pushing and pushing to try to get an answer, because all you'll do is cause them to be very irritated and upset with you. Don't ask unnecessary questions when you see that your spouse would prefer not to talk about something. Case number one, let's study a case. I have a very controlling nature. When I wish for something to be done in a certain way, I make certain that that's the way it's going to be. My intense determination has enabled me to accomplish a lot in my life. Without acting mean or becoming angry, others are intimidated by my strong demeanor and usually back down from me. When I was married, I was certain that my spouse would be devoted to me in my every wish. My need for control was manifested in many areas of our life. This began with my insisting that the wedding be exactly the way I wanted it to be. So this was a controlling, dominating individual. After our first anniversary, I looked back at how my spouse acquiesced to my wishes, and I felt that I had a great marriage. Now that we are married an entire year, how would you rate the quality of our marriage? I asked my spouse. This was one of the first times I had explicitly asked my spouse for feedback. I'm glad you asked, was the unhappy response. I probably wouldn't have the courage to tell you what I really feel. But now that you expressed your willingness to hear what I have to say, I want to tell you that I had never imagined that marriage would be so painful. Your controlling manner has caused me to give in to you, but I resent you immensely. I was thinking to myself that I don't know how long I can last with things being the way they are. Either you become less controlling or you're going to lose me entirely. Wow, what an admonition. This hit me like a ton of bricks. I never realized that my desire to control people was leading me on the road to lose what I had fought all my life to get. After a number of long discussions, it became clear to me that only by giving up my demand to control and becoming more sensitive to my spouse's preferences, wants, and needs would our marriage work for both of us. I saw that by giving up the demand for total control, I would gain so much more than if I tried to make everything just the way they are and get it my way. Okay, personality differences, let's continue. Each person on this planet has a different personality than anyone else. Nevertheless, some people are more similar than others. The more similar two people are, the easier it usually is for them to understand each other. Common beliefs leads to common expectations, leads to better cooperation. Regardless of how similar any two people are, they'll be different in many ways. Regardless of how different two people are, they'll be similar in some ways. The task of marriage is to understand your spouse's personality in order to interact in the best possible way with each other and to benefit from the differences in your personalities. Get along with what you have in common and appreciate your differences. When you understand your spouse's personality, there are many things that you might have considered as faults and problems, and now you will view them as just as differences that create challenges for your growth. Because remember, most psychologists will tell you there will always be points of disagreement between a spouse, and that's healthy. You can have up to 10 or maybe 15 points of disagreement. Personalities vary between those which are highly complex and those which are simpler, less complicated ones. What makes a personality complex? when someone has many diverse and contradictory parts, and when someone has an intense emotional nature, when one has a deep and creative intelligence together with a secretive nature, that makes that person a complex person. When two people work in harmony, personality differences can help both of them to utilize their individual strengths as a team. They've got to work as a unit. When there isn't harmony, differences cause clashes and quarrels. The challenge of personality differences is to create a peaceful relationship. Now, some especially challenging personality differences are, here's some examples. When one partner is very cold and the other person is very warm. Another challenging personality difference. One partner loves action, risks, and excitement, and the other partner wants routine, the familiar, and is highly conventional. Here's another personality difference that can create a crisis. When one partner is very rude and regulation oriented, one partner is very rule and regulation oriented and the other cherishes freedom. That could be an issue as well. Another area of clashes, when one partner loves talking about feelings and the other cherishes logic and reason and considers talking about emotions a total waste of time. I had this very interestingly with an individual who's been married close to 40 years, married everyone out, and suddenly she says, my husband and I have nothing to talk about. They both had very, very busy commercial lives and worked full-time jobs, and now that so they basically were able to avoid talking to each other for many, many, many decades until as they say, they couldn't cover it up anymore. Once the last child was married, now she's having issues in terms of her husband being too quiet, and she's reached out to me and I've given her some great pointers in terms of what to do to be able to generate conversation, read a book together, learn a sefer together, go out on trips together, take vacations together, discuss experiences together, discuss social activities that are happening in the community together. Another area which could be a point of contention is when a partner has a strong need for togetherness and the other has a strong need for privacy and to be alone. Or when one partner is highly organized and the other person thrives on chaos, which we sometimes see. Or here's another area of contention. When one partner loves having many guests and company over to visit and the other person loves peace and quiet and feels uncomfortable in the presence of even small crowds. And lastly, here's another area of contention. When one partner lives by the clock and always wants to do things on schedule, and the other partner is always late and the exact time for anything is not important to that person. Husband and wife will need to work out their personality differences in ways that work for both of them. In some instances, this can be easy and smooth. In other instances, this can be very difficult. It can take much effort. What is of vital importance is that each one respects the other and that both want to work things out in a way that is in their mutual best interests. There is growth to be found when two people are similar and growth when they are different. You can grow when you're similar and you grow when you're different. True growth is elevating yourself in the situation in which you find yourself. You can be challenged and you can decide, I'm going to use this opportunity to grow. Some people relate to specific personality systems and others don't. Case number 2. I'm a night person while my spouse is a morning person. I'm very tired in the morning, and as the day progresses, my energy increases. My spouse, on the other hand, has a lot of energy right away in the morning, but gets tired as the day goes on. And you have to appreciate what happens here, as they're very uniquely different. As soon as my spouse wakes up, I hear a cheerful, good morning, good morning. It's time to wake up. I want to wish you a super great day. Spare me, I say to myself. Cut it out and keep your good cheer to yourself. It takes me a couple of hours to really wake up. My spouse often tells me that I've been rude in the morning. I definitely don't mean to be rude or unfriendly, but I need a quiet environment for a while until I feel I'm really awake. I didn't realize how hurt my spouse felt about this until one day I was told, I feel rejected when you ignore me in the morning. I know otherwise, but I feel unloved and not respected by the way you react towards me in the morning. I explained at length that in the home in which I grew up in, we all avoided each other in the morning because our home was a place where our energy was low in the morning and we didn't really get it together energy-wise till the middle of the day. We were a caring family, but it took us a couple of hours until we were friendly and outgoing. My spouse was understanding after I explained my emotional tendencies and no longer took my lack of enthusiasm in the morning as being personal. I accepted upon myself to speak in a friendlier manner as soon as I woke up so that my spouse would be happy. Not having my spouse trying to get me to be more cheerful than I actually felt enabled me to increase my energy level even faster. So it's all a matter of communication, especially where you see personality differences. Let's all go on to the next case. Case number 3. I have 2 opposite parts. Part of me is bold and willing to take emotional risks. The other part of me is highly cautious and finds it difficult to approach people or ask for things that most other people would be able to do without a second thought. My wife has difficulties with both of these. She is very grounded and balanced. She has no fear of speaking up, of negotiating, and of requesting refunds in a standard situation. But she doesn't like to take bold risks like I do. On the other hand, she can't understand why I find it difficult to confront other people in standard situations. She has no problem with that. What will they do to you anyway? What will you lose? She says to me. Of course she's right, but I still have these two parts of me. I don't find my two parts in conflict. Each one has its time and place. My bold risk part has enabled me to accomplish a lot. I'm not one for major financial risks, so my risk taking is more in the area of not fearing failure. You really must overcome your fears of approaching people when it's appropriate to do so, my wife told me one day. Learn from the times you were able to do so spontaneously. That was a valid point. I also saw that my wife herself could serve as my role model. I made a list of situations she handled remarkably well that I didn't. Then I asked her what her inner thoughts were when she confronted those people or negotiated. She told me a few ideas that I've begun to integrate into my personality. 1, you will always have a right to speak up for your valid rights. 2, the only power anyone else has over you is the power you give them, something that many people know and many of our mentors have taught us. The only power people have over us is that the power we allow them to have. Don't empower others at your own expense. Realize that you have the power that anyone else has. Just allow yourself to feel it. 3, if you find it difficult to confront someone, imagine him or her as a young infant, or see them or him or her as he or she will be in 120 years from now when they're less in a position to be able to harm you or answer back to you. 4, imagine a powerful role model and see yourself talking and acting the way that person would. When my wife saw that I wanted to learn from her, she began viewing herself as my coach, and that made it easier for her to accept my weaker part, and at the same time, she was able to strengthen it. Let's go on to case number 4. I'm much more emotional than my husband. I tend to get easily excited about things, both when good things happen and when something goes wrong. I speak rather quickly when I'm excited, and I become enthusiastic about many things. I'm very expressive with my emotions, and the look on my face will broadcast the emotional state that I'm in at any given moment. She's just a hyper girl. My husband, on the other hand, has a mathematical mind. He speaks more slowly and deliberately than I do. He generally hides his true feelings, and his face usually isn't very expressive. Even when he's happy about something, he speaks calmly. He doesn't have as many emotional ups and downs as I do, because she's more of a huge type A. We both care for each other very much and appreciate our differences in temperament and personality. But I have a problem trying to convince my husband about the validity of my position when we disagree with each other. The more excited and enthusiastic I get, the more wary and cautious my husband becomes. I am the more wary, and this used to make me speak in a more even excited and enthusiastic manner, and my husband would react by becoming even more cautious. I finally realized that the only way I could convince my husband of the validity of my position would be to speak to him via his own style of communicating. I had to contain my enthusiasm. I had to be more calm, more controlled like him. I had to be more even-tempered. I had to try to speak more deliberately, as my husband does. I cited proofs that my position was valid. I don't always get my point across this way, but I am much more successful than I used to be. Case number 5. I have a compulsive personality, and my spouse has a histrionic one. He's more volatile. I love lists, and I'm totally dedicated to using all my time and effort at succeeding at what I do. I tend to be a perfectionist, and I'm willing to repeat doing things until they're done to my satisfaction. Even then, I feel that I could do better, but I accept that there's a limit. My wife tends to be histrionic. She's excitable and dramatic. She overacts when things go wrong, and she shouts with excitement when she hears good news. Her emotionalism is a bit too much for me, and she constantly complains that I'm too cold and too rigid. She often tells me that I need to become more spontaneous and more relaxed. I, on the other hand, tell her that she needs to take things in a more balanced manner. We realized that what attracted us to each other was exactly our differences, which is great. We need to have differences between husband and wife, wife and husband, and we need to appreciate them and use them in a more constructive fashion. I liked my wife's emotional expressiveness, and she liked my emotional stability. We both complemented each other beautifully. But after the marriage, these differences created frequent challenges. We each wished that the other would be more similar to ourselves. When my wife sounded too excited and enthusiastic about something and tried to convince me of its merits, I became skeptical as her emotional intensity increased. When I had to convince her about something, I tried to point out the logic and the facts and did this in a calm and rational tone of voice. But since I didn't sound enthusiastic, she was not convinced. After many conversations about our personalities, we came to the conclusion that to make things work best for both of us, we would both need to make changes. And you have to be willing and open to making changes, ladies and gentlemen. I knew that I would need to become more emotionally expressive. My wife saw that she would need to decrease the drama when she spoke. This was not an easy task for either of us, but nevertheless, we weren't put on this world to have it easy. We're here to change and to climb up and to better our personalities and improve our midos. This, however, is much better than both of us insisting that we are who we are and we just live with our mediocre marriage, which we've changed into making a fantastic marriage. Case number 6. When my husband and I need to make a decision, I find myself feeling tense and frustrated. We were both in our 30s when we got married, and we're used to making our own decisions, which is what happens when you're an older single. Now that we're married, we needed to come to common conclusions, which means now we have to make decisions together, and we were used to making decisions on our own. My husband tends to push off decisions until the last minute. He was fond of quoting a sign he once saw in his business office. If it weren't for the last minute, nothing would ever get done around here. Even with our marriage, I wasn't 100% certain that the wedding was going to be held until I was marching to the chuppah. Before that, my husband would go in circles weighing each option. He himself is calm about weighing options as long as possible. Making the decision that causes him anxiety, while thinking about possibilities is enjoyable for him. I'm just the opposite. I feel much more comfortable after a decision is made. I like to come to a final conclusion as early as possible. Then I can work out the details and solve the problems that arise. I would prefer coming to a decision that isn't perfect as long as the decision is made. The reason decision making is so difficult for us is that my husband and I can both see many possibilities in everything we discuss. Each possibility has its pros and its cons. Even after seeming to come to a decision, my husband will usually say, wait a minute, I just thought of a few more possibilities. One example that comes to mind is the decision we needed to make about where we should be for Pesach. Should we stay at home in our small city? Should we go to New York where we have many friends? Perhaps we should go to our parents or to my husband's parents. Maybe it should be 50-50. Then there's the option of traveling to Israel for Pesach and staying in a hotel in Yerushalayim. Where will our children feel best? Maybe we should go to Australia, England, or Switzerland where we have relatives that we haven't seen in a long time. If we stay home, however, we'll be able to invite a number of people who are unfamiliar with making a proper Seder. We were discussing this for a few weeks, and the more we discussed it, the further away we came from making a final decision. I was getting more and more nervous. If we would be staying home, I would need to hire help to assist me in cleaning up the house and prepare the food for Pesach. My husband kept telling me not to worry. We would certainly be reaching a decision in a day or two. But would we? I was skeptical. I was afraid we would decide at the very last minute and then only by default. If it would be too late to make travel plans, we would end up staying home and I would really need more time to prepare. I analyzed the situation. I saw that my husband would accept any decision about which I felt strongly, but I wanted us to decide together. I didn't want to make the decision on my own. That wouldn't be nice. I felt that if I were the one who decided, my husband would blame me if anything went wrong. I told my fears to my husband and he assured me that he wouldn't blame me if anything went wrong. Even though he said this, I knew that he might convey his displeasure non-verbally with his body language. However, when I focused on what would enable us to have the greatest amount of shalom bayis, marital harmony, I realized that we both would be best off if I made a quick decision, so I did. Making this decision taught me a few principles I now follow when we need to decide on something together. I now write down the pros and cons of each possibility. If either my husband or I feel strongly about an option and the other doesn't feel so strongly about it, we agree to do what the person who feels strongly about it suggests. I also see that when one path is much better for me than the other, because the other path will be highly distressing, I tell this to my husband and he is open to spare me that stress. He might kvetch a little about this, but he is giving me permission to ignore the kvetching. If we both don't mind too much which option we take, we arbitrarily choose one option so I don't have to experience the frustration of indecision. Case number 7. My husband had been Mr. Cool in yeshiva. He learned well and he had great qualities of character, or midos. When anyone would talk about him, they would say, he's very cool. I always liked this quality in people. It's the diametric opposite of members of my family who were emotionally cold, would be uncomfortable when my friends visit. If anyone in my family would be embarrassingly open. When I first met my husband, everything about him was an expression of his being a bit aloof. He wasn't arrogant or conceited, just cool. He was careful not to speak Lashon Hara, which is evil language, but when there wasn't a question of Lashon Hara, he was on the cynical side, and we know cynicism is not a good thing. His touch of aloofness or feeling a little bit too much about himself and cynicism, yet at the same time his kindness and consideration were very attractive to me when we dated. A few months into the marriage, however, I began to miss some of the emotionalism that was in my family. I told my husband a number of times that I wished he would be more emotionally expressive. He was too quiet. I still liked his basic personality, and I was happy with my marriage, but I wished he was more emotional. One day I bumped into a teacher who made our shidduch, and I expressed my concerns to her that he was just a little too aloof, a little too quiet. She smiled a kind smile and said to me, I expected you to come to me one day to discuss this. If you recall, I mentioned to you that while I feel the two of you will be a good match, you will need to accept that you will be missing some of the emotional warmth of your family. I know that for you, being in that environment all the time was too much, but it's normal to miss it, and the further you're away from it, the more it might build up in your mind how wonderful it was and how it's difficult that you don't have it anymore. Let me tell you something. I feel certain that in your case, with time and with children coming along the way, you'll be able to elicit more of your husband's emotions. He'll change with time. Meanwhile, try to accept him and value his positive qualities. As we say in this wonderful work of mine, choose your love and then love your choice. Okay, what happens when personalities are different and you don't do anything about it? Let me share with you an incredible story of a woman who writes about her life after her husband passed away. We can learn a lot from this story. How we have to be careful when we date, have to check things out. This is going back now, post-Holocaust era, when they didn't do much checking and people would just, went into marriages quickly to build lives after the shattered experiences of Europe. But listen to this incredible story, and there are incredible lessons that can be gleaned from it. And the woman writes, I just celebrated my 80th birthday surrounded by my children, grandchildren, and quite a few great-grandchildren. By nature, I'm not a very sentimental person. I was forced to grow up very quickly to become an adult at an age where most of my friends were still playing childish games. I worked hard all my life, raising a large family while trying to help my husband, of blessed memory, pay the bills, and I had very little time for reflection. Things are different now. I have time on my hands. I'm recently widowed, and I live alone in a beautiful, spacious apartment that my son bought for us some 15 years ago after he made a fortune in real estate. At first, my husband, Yankel, wouldn't hear of moving to another apartment. What's wrong with the house where we raised you? He said to my son. But my son Laser somehow persuaded his father to agree to move up to an upscale, beautiful apartment. Few people were happier than I when on my moving day. Our old apartment held too many memories, too many unshed tears, too many sleepless nights and exhaustion-filled days. It contained the memories of the tension and bewilderment I had felt as a young bride, alone in a foreign country without my parents at my side on my wedding day, because we're going to hear her story very soon. And she writes, I was born in 1940. My parents hid me in a non-Jewish neighbor's house during the Holocaust. When the war ended, my parents found each other, and then they fled blood-soaked Europe for Palestine, which is Israel, shortly before Israel's War of Independence. We spent a few months in a transit camp and eventually moved to a small Moshav, or a settlement, where my father had some distant relatives. My parents went on to have 6 more children, including a set of twins. They were incredibly poor. My father worked for a local farmer and spent hours in the fields tending the crops. We lived in a small cottage where the children were crammed into a tiny bedroom. But we spent most of our time running wild in the fields, beyond our settlement. As you know, Israel has many fields in kibbutzim. Growing strong and bronzed from the sun. Despite our poverty, we were happy, wonderful children. At the age of 7, I joined the other children of the Moshav who attended a Jewish school in a nearby slightly larger community. I had 3 years of schooling during which I learned the basics, and then I graduated to adulthood. At the age of 13, as a young girl, I got my first job at the local supermarket, or makolet, as they call it in Hebrew, turning over whatever I earned to my parents. A few years earlier, while operating a tractor on the farm, my father had suffered an accident and was in constant pain. He was unable to work much. My mother did mending or sewing for women in the neighborhood community in order to help put food on the table. All my brothers and sisters also went to work at an early age because there was no other option. Even with the frugal lives we led, wearing cast-offs and sandals we had long outgrown, there wasn't enough money for the basics. And this is very important, this backdrop, to understand what's going to happen in her life. A few days after my 16th birthday, I was in the supermarket working when my sister Liba paid me a surprise visit. Dina, she said, looking over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. Dina, someone's coming to see you. Someone's coming from a faraway place to see you. What in the world is she talking about? To see me for what? A bacher, she said, giggling. I overheard Abba and Ima whispering about it in the kitchen. It can't be, I argued. I'm not old enough to get married. A bacher is like a young man. Why not? Ahuva, your friend got married last year and she's only 17. Ahuva was my neighbor's daughter who married a boy from a neighborhood settlement and moved to a kibbutz in the south against her parents' wishes. But I was not Ahuva and our home was very different. He's coming in a few minutes, Liba continued. No, he can't come. I panicked. I had no desire to get married. I'm going home. But you can't just leave the store, said Liba. And then she offered to take my place. Thrilled at being granted a reprieve, I slipped out the back door and I ran all the way home. On my way, I collided with my father, who was limping along on his way to the makolet. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed. What are you going home for, Dina? He said. You usually work until late. Liba took over for me today, I mumbled as I ran inside the house. I flung myself onto my narrow bed that I shared with my two younger sisters and I began to cry. My mother found me there a few minutes later, crying my heart out. In between sobs, I shared what Liba had told me, begging my mother to tell me, it's not true, Mommy, right? I'm not getting married. It's not true. She was silent for a while and then she said, Abba heard about a fine young man who came here from Belgium. He comes from a wealthy family and is looking for a young girl who's refined. If you marry him, you won't have to work so hard in the supermarket anymore. You'll have a home of your own with plenty of food and clothing and everything we cannot give you. I tried to argue with my mother and later with my father, but their minds were made up. They insisted that Yankel Klar, a young man in his mid-20s, who recently deceased father had been a successful diamond merchant, was a dream ticket for me. Yankel was offering his future wife a life of prosperity and ease, provided that I moved to Belgium. He had heard about me through mutual relatives who spoke highly of my father and recommended the match. My parents loved me dearly, but they were struggling to feed and support their large family. Since my father's accident, things had gotten much worse. My parents struggled every day just to put food on the table. How would they marry off anybody or any of their siblings? Though I was only 16, my parents viewed this as a fantastic opportunity. I was mature and experienced in caring for my younger siblings, and they didn't think my age would be an obstacle. No one asked me how I felt about getting married at such a young age. No one asked me whether I agreed to marry a foreigner with whom I could barely converse, as I spoke Hebrew and he only spoke Yiddish. We had been raised with no questioning obedience to our parents, and their very word was law. The concept of respect for one's elders was just the way it was. That's how we lived our lives, so we didn't question our parents. My father spoke to Yankel for a while, and he was impressed with his maturity and his ehrlichkeit, or his refinement. He also spoke to one of his friends who knew Yankel's family from the old country and vouched for him. My fate was decided. I would become Yankel's bride. Yankel seemed nice enough. He was good looking, though was mostly quiet during our short conversation. I attribute that to our language barrier and to the fact that he's probably uncomfortable in his strange surrounding. And so upon my father's nodding and approval, I smiled and whispered, Mazel Tov, as my parents drank a l'chaim and signed the Tanaim, which is the contract of what the young man will agree to give and what the father of the girl will give. I was a kala at the ripe old age of 16 and a half. I had no idea that my husband-to-be was 11 years older than I was, and that reports of his family's financial status were greatly exaggerated, as I was later to learn. In truth, Yankel's father had not been a diamond merchant. It was all a made-up story. But he was a simple diamond cutter who had died in debt. Yankel lived with his widowed mother in a small apartment and worked at a low-paying job, so the whole thing was a fake-out. He had been looking for a shidduch for many years and was overjoyed to have found one. In the 1950s, when modern psychology had not yet been born and people were labeled interesting and reclusive rather than having letters of alphabets assigned to them like we have today, I had no idea that Yankel's lengthy silences, his insistence on adhering to a strict schedule, and his disinterest in emotional aspects of life signified anything more than a personality type. One of the main things that I make sure that I put down on people's top 10 lists when I draw them up for them is the person emotionally healthy. Is he emotionally balanced? Is he or she emotionally stable? Is he or she emotionally balanced? That's very important. We must check into that. Today, perhaps, Yankel might be diagnosed with some disorder, but in Europe in the 1950s, he was simply considered different. The plan was that Yankel would eventually bring our entire family to Europe and support them. After all, he was a wealthy young man. Yankel returned home 2 days after our vort. I was to follow shortly afterward, boarding with distant relatives who would help me set up my apartment. My parents were to follow a few months later, right before my wedding, which was scheduled for late summer. Yankel will send us money for tickets, my father explained. Maybe he'll send enough so that Liba can come with us for the wedding too. Liba was Dina's younger sister. Liba was only 15 months younger than I, and the thought of having her at my wedding cheered me up greatly. Still, I was miserable throughout the boat journey across the Mediterranean, and I cried for most of it. My mother's cousin met me at the port and accompanied me to my lodgings, keeping me up a steady chatter and assuring me that though everything seemed strange, it would get easier with time. I had no idea that it would be several long years before I would even see my parents again, because the idea, the proposal that they would come for the wedding was just pure nonsense. I didn't know that I would be accompanied to the chuppah by strangers, and that my life as a married woman would be very different from what I'd expected. I didn't see much of Yankel during our engagement, but I did meet his mother, a very sorrowful widow with whom I could barely exchange 2 words. In the meantime, I became increasingly anxious since the apartment Yankel had chosen for us was on the 4th floor of a decrepit apartment building some distance from the heart of the Jewish community. Where were the beautiful furnishings that I'd been promised? What about the linens and the trousseau that I'd been promised? And most importantly, where were my parents who I was promised were going to attend, and they would be to be sent tickets to come to the wedding? They weren't coming for the wedding, I soon discovered. To my consternation, Yankel had sent them tickets, and they were too polite to demand tickets. The woman who was taking care of me until the wedding was appalled that my parents were not coming. If your parents want to come, they'll find a way to pay for it, she said. Eventually, I summoned the courage to send a messenger to Yankel to ask him about the tickets for my parents, but I never got a straight answer from him. Apparently, there was no money for tickets. Yankel and his mother couldn't afford it, and neither could my parents. On my wedding day, I was accompanied to the chuppah by 2 virtual strangers, the distant relatives who had graciously taken me into their home. As I stood next to Yankel under the chuppah, I knew I should use the time to daven and beseech God for my descendants. But all I felt was an intense grief. I was barely 17 and I was getting married to someone I hardly knew without any family at my side. I somehow survived the night, allowing the guests to dance with me, smiling and saying the right things until the wedding was over. After all the guests had left, I stood next to my new husband, ready to follow him to our apartment. "Wait a moment," he said to me. "I'll be right back." I watched as he approached the caterer, reached into his pocket, and took out a wad of bills, which he counted and handed to him. He did the same with the photographer and the musician. Then he returned to me. "You're paying for everything now?" I asked. "Yes, I just paid for our wedding with the money that we got as gift money." I was stunned. In Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, people gave household items to the husband, to the bride and groom. Apparently here in Europe, it was the custom to give the young couple money. But why did Yankel have to use the money that we got as gifts to pay for the wedding? What happened to all the money he supposedly had? "My father passed away with a lot of outstanding debt," Yankel said to me. "He was sick for a while and he ate up his savings. I had nothing else left to pay for our wedding." "Then what are we going to live on?" I asked. She's experiencing one nightmare after the next. "I'll look for a better job," said Yankel, "and I'm sure you're willing to work hard too. They said you're a very energetic young woman." I nodded. I did have a lot of energy, but I was stunned. I also had a lot of questions about my new life with Yankel, but I didn't need to worry. He had it all figured out. A day after our last Sheva brachas, Yankel informed me that he found me a job in the local bakery, kneading dough and baking bread. Wow, what a life. Thus began my new life as a quote-unquote pampered bride. I worked hard in the bakery and later in a butcher shop to help support our family. In the meantime, Yankel held a series of odd jobs at which he earned minimum wage. So much for the wealthy guy that was supposed to marry her. I wondered why he didn't seem to last long at any job, but had no one to ask. Our children were born close together, and I cared for them alone with no help from Yankel. He was clumsy with the children, and he claimed that crying babies made him anxious. He also needed his sleep at night, which meant that I remained awake during the endless nights without any help from him. Life was challenging, busy, and also very lonely. I had no friends or relatives and virtually no support system. My parents had no idea what I was going through, and I didn't tell them. I shed many tears. Yankel's mother came over from time to time, mostly to offer advice and suggestions about how I could manage better, if I did things her way. Yankel was completely submissive to his mother. He visited her every day, and she made most of the decisions in our life. It seemed like a nightmare. Looking back, I realized that there was a period when I was quite depressed. There were days I didn't want to get out of bed. I felt trapped and cried a lot. I fantasized about leaving Yankel and going back home to my parents and siblings, but it was just that, a pure fantasy. The idea of divorce in that era was a shameful thing. People didn't get divorced in the 1950s. I didn't have the courage or the emotional strength to go through with it, and I couldn't bear to hurt my defenseless children or my parents. It would crush them. Throughout those years, I kept in touch with my parents via letters and the occasional phone call, which was very expensive. How I yearned to go visit them in Israel, to see my brothers and sisters, several of whom had gotten married in the interim that I didn't even see. But travel was impractical, not to mention so expensive back then. Now lonely I was, how I was trapped in my tiny apartment with an emotionally distant husband, no money, few friends, and a house full of young children. Even though I had not put myself in this position, I was also embarrassed to admit the truth about my life. 6 years after my wedding, my parents finally managed to scrape enough money together for the plane ride to come to visit me in Belgium. It was an emotional reunion. We embraced and I introduced them to the grandchildren they had never met. During their stay, my parents quickly realized that they had been misled and that things were not as they had imagined them at all. Not only was I living in abject poverty, but they saw that something about Yankel was really off emotionally. They asked quietly if I was happy, and when I broke into tears, they asked if I would consider divorce. I had 3 small children close in age, and I was expecting my 4th. Where would I go if I were to get divorced? Although Yankel was an absentee father and a husband, even when he was home, he never raised his voice or hurt us in any way. He just did not know how to relate to people. Perhaps today we would say maybe he has Asperger's. I knew that if I left him, my children would be tainted by the stigma of divorce. And so I told my parents that it was okay, that I would make it work. We hugged and cried when I accompanied my parents to the airport. I knew I couldn't see them. I wouldn't see them again for a long time, and it was right. The next time they came was for my eldest son's bar mitzvah. The years passed quickly. I gave birth to 6 children and raised them alone in our tiny apartment while I worked part-time with little encouragement and almost no support. Yet Hashem was good to me. My children were sweet and good-natured, easy to raise, which gave me the courage to keep forging ahead. I cooked nourishing meals for them. I kept them clean, and I taught them to be mentioned, to have good middos and care for each other. So while one person may not get one thing, but they get something else, Hashem is always so balanced in the way He deals with us.